Hello, my lovely psychology students. Let's start with our first definition of abnormality. But let's ask a quick question first of all. Can you define what is meant by, are you ready for this? What do we mean by normal? Have to think. Can you define what we mean by the word normal? Don't give me an example. The exam hint here. In the exam, if they ask you to define something, you define it first before you give an example. And also look at the mark allocation. If it's just for 1 mark, then it's just the definition. If it's 2 marks, definition, and either elaborate or give the example then. But let's get back to this. What do we mean by normal? Now, I'm sure if you're talking to the screen, you're probably saying something like what everybody else does. It's not different. It's not abnormal. Or it's conforming. Now, you're saying right things, but you're not actually defining it. Let's try this one. This one might be a little bit easier. What's abnormal? Now, don't tell me it's not normal or it's the opposite of normal. Can you give me a definition? So you might be saying, well, it's different. Just because someone's slightly different, does it actually mean they're abnormal? And is that actually defining what abnormal is? No, the whole point of this is to make you realize these two words are really difficult to give as a simple definition. Now, the one I want to really focus on is abnormal. Abnormal. It's hard to define, and even psychologists have found this very hard to define. And that's why when they are looking at diagnosing a person with abnormal behavior, they can't just have one simplistic explanation. And let's have a look at the spec. The spec that we're going to look at has 4 definitions: deviation from ideal mental health, deviation from social norms, statistical frequency. Please note, it can also be known as statistical infrequency, and failure to function adequately. And by now, you're fully aware everything we do always has AO3, so we will be looking at some evaluations. The one we're going to focus on now is deviation from social norms. Now, each of these definitions, in a way, is a way for us to measure a person's behavior to see whether we can diagnose. That's the way I like to look at the definitions. And also, before we get started, it's very difficult just to use one of those as our measuring stick. And psychologists have, they've realized this over the years. You cannot just have one simple explanation of what abnormality means. And this is why we look at it from different definitions, so therefore we can measure it differently. But let's get started. Let's start with deviation from social norms. I always say, understand the terms. Deviation means moving away from social norms. You all know what social norms is because you've learned about it through the years. Behavior, according to this definition, is seen as abnormal if it is deviating from the social norms. So let's investigate that concept further. Deviation from social norms means that we're moving away from the social rules that help regulate everybody's behavior within society. It's how one should behave, how everyone is expected to behave within society. And if we deviate from that acceptable behavior, it's then going to be seen as being undesirable by the members of that particular society, and therefore can be seen as being abnormal. I can hear yourself asking, well, let's just kind of reclassify what's social norms. Well, these are the standards of acceptable behavior, the expectations of behavior. These are the unwritten rules that we are expected to behave. They're not laws, they're not written down, but it's the people within society that actually say this is what we see as acceptable behavior. So it's set and carried out by the social group within each society. Now, for us, a simple norm is being polite. Thank you, please. So therefore, a desirable norm, That's the behavior. When you were growing up, you were taught, please, right? Thank you. You know, we say it's an acceptable norm. Somebody holds the door open for you and you say thank you to them. An undesirable norm is confrontation. You know, looking for that fight, being, you know, quite aggressive to somebody, perhaps in your approach. So that's seen as undesirable. But there is a little bit of a but here. Just because someone might be a bit rude, a little bit aggressive, a bit selfish, right, a bit spiteful, those are things that we don't see as desirable. Does that mean they're abnormal? Come on, be honest with yourself. We've all been spiteful. We've all been greedy. We've all been selfish, right? We've all been rude. But does that mean you're abnormal? Here's the key to it. It's the context and the degree in which that social norm is broken. That's what accounts for the abnormal behavior. Let's understand what we mean by context and what we mean by degree. Context means it's the situation in which that social norm has been broken. An example I always use is that you come to lesson. There's your teacher, or me, Mrs. Smith, standing there in the front of the class, ready to teach. Not only will you be scarred for life, but you would think, woohoo, Mrs. Smith has lost it. I'm standing there wearing my swimming costume. You're kind of going to think, what's happening here? It's not a prank. And I'm getting ready to teach. Because it's in the wrong context, wearing a swimming costume to teaching every day, that will be seen as being abnormal. Because there's an acceptable context and an unacceptable context. It's acceptable to wear a swimming costume at a pool and at the beach, but not to wear as a teacher to deliver your lessons. Degree means by how much that social norm's been broke. Like I said, we've all been rude, we've all been selfish, but it's how much. If a person is constantly being rude or constantly being confrontational, then we're going to think there's something wrong here, because why are they like this? And therefore, because it's the amount they broke that social norm, is seen as being abnormal. What we've got to realize here, that norms are specific to each culture and each generation within a particular culture. What your granny or your great granny saw as a social norm, norms change because cultures change. They're not fixed. So and that's why you probably find the older generations will be saying, oh, in my time, that wouldn't be seen as acceptable, but it's acceptable now. And that's what we've got to keep in mind, that not all norms are the same for each culture, and not all generations will have the same norms, because our society evolves, and we've got to remember. And therefore, I'm going to use the term here universal. The term here universal is used as a measuring term. That means we cannot truly say that there are social norms that occur in every single society. And we've got to be aware of that, because we can then misjudge a person as being abnormal if we're using the wrong social norms. You know, perhaps in our society, we might see the social norm is that you have a bath every day. But in some societies, they can't have a bath every day because there's such a shortage of water, so it's not a norm to have a bath every day. So then we might kind of think, oof, they're a bit strange. They don't bathe every day. But we're using our social norm to measure them. And this is going to be turned into an evaluation as well. Now, I just want to link to a nice example, antisocial personality disorder. It's a classification of a personality type, so therefore a person's behavior, by the DSM. DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We're on version 5 now and in this diagnostic tool, It has all the criteria for all our mental disorders and syndromes so that we can make a correct classification. So what I'd like you to do now is pause the video now and do a little bit of research. If you've got the pink head and the green head girl, you'll be able to find and do that. But virtually all the other A-level textbooks will probably use this as an example as well. So what is it? And why is this an example from deviation from social norms? So what I'd like you to do is pause the video now and see what you can find out. Give me some information. Great stuff. Thanks for pausing. So let's have a little look. What did you find? See if you've got the same thing that I have. Now, antisocial personality disorder is when a person has certain behaviors. For example, they're very impulsive, high levels of aggression. They are very irresponsible. Now, this, by psychiatrists, they will diagnose this person to have this type of mental personality. It's because their behavior is seen as antisocial. They have the absence of pro-social moral standards. They don't have an understanding of the moral standards of what is acceptable, what's right, and what's wrong. And therefore, their behavior is going to be antisocial. And therefore, that's why it's an example of deviation from social norms. They're unable to conform to the social norms of society, therefore seen as being abnormal, and therefore perhaps getting this diagnosis of having antisocial personality disorder. Now, as you know, everything has AO3s. Woohoo! I want us to jump to the second one because we kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier. What does cultural relativism mean? And why is that a problem for this definition? Straightforward. Cultural relativism. Think of what the word is. Relativism, make it simpler. Relative. So that means it's specific. Think about your relatives. They are yours, specific to you. If I'm not related to you, so therefore they're not relative to me. And that's what we mean here. Things in a culture are specific to that culture, therefore not specific to other cultures. So think about social norms. Social norms are specific to specific cultures and subcultures. Therefore, like we said earlier, very few social norms are universal that apply to every single culture. And this can be a problem if we're using this definition to diagnose somebody as having abnormal behavior, because we may be using the wrong social norms to diagnose their behavior. So if we've got somebody, say, for example, they are from, let's have a think, Cuba, but they're living in Britain or just newly living, but we're diagnosing them as being deviating from social norms using the British social norms. Actually, they're going to be classified as being abnormal because they're going to be using the social norms for their culture. So this definition is not going to be very helpful in diagnosing abnormality, but there is a but. To make it a helpful definition, we need to use the social norms of that culture in order to make that diagnosis. And that's going to help us. That's going to reduce the cultural bias in our diagnosis, because what we're doing is using the social norms of that culture where that person is from. Let's have a look at another one of these definitions. How can this definition lead to people's human rights being abused? Now, a problem with this and how it can relate is that perhaps we're too reliant on this definition of abnormality. We're too reliant on using this as a judgment call. And that actually causes a problem. If we look at historically, when a person acts out of perhaps what is seen for their perhaps ethnicity, their gender, their sex, if they're seen as acting out of that, then we can say, well, hold on, they're being abnormal. Historically, there are plenty of examples. If we go quite far back in time, right, and we talk about drapetomania, this was when Black slaves got diagnosed as having drapetomania because they kept trying to run away from their slave masters. So actually, it was labeling them as being abnormal and therefore controlling them because they wouldn't want to be seen as this abnormal individual. So therefore, they would stop running away. So really, it can abuse and control. The same with nymphomania. Now, I know we all think nymphomania is related to sex, and yes, it is. But if historically, if a woman, right, had sexual attraction, especially a middle-class woman, had a sexual attraction to a working-class man, she would be seen that she's going against the norm. One, she's interested in sex because back in history, sex was a male-dominant activity that only men should enjoy. And also working class, going below them. So if a woman experienced this, she would be regarded as being abnormal because she's going against the social norms of what's expected of her. But also, even nowadays, by diagnosing somebody using this definition could actually be labeling them and therefore controlling their behavior. So it is a problem. Everything always has strengths and limitations. You'll always find there's more negative than there is positive. I'm going to finish off with the key strength, and I would like you, when you're doing some independent work, to look at the last one. Why can this definition not be used as a sole definition? You can explore that one. So what is a key strength of this definition? Its key strength is that it's got real life application. That means we can see it and apply it to the real world. Because when we can diagnose people with, for example, antisocial personality disorder, it allows us to understand why they're deviating, why they've got this abnormal behavior. And that's a good thing. It allows us to get people the help that they need because we can make an accurate diagnosis of that behavior. However, please note, right, that it's also important that we can't use it as a sole definition. And this is where you come in. How can we answer that question? Now remember, let's revisit the area. Let's make our notes. And if you've got any questions, send me an email. My lovelies, I will see you in our next video. Thank you for being here.